Welcome to The Backstory, a program from the North Dakota News Cooperative that takes an in-depth look at the stories we're reporting for you. I'm Sabrina Halvorson, CEO of the North Dakota News Cooperative. Joining me is Michael Standaert, our lead reporter. The article we're talking about this week was headlined, School Districts Struggle to Sell Bond Measures. And Michael, I think the thing that really jumps out in this story is that these bond measures can get support from the majority of voters and still fail. Bismarck and Surrey, which you talk about in the article, they both got about 58% of the votes. But North Dakota requires 60% for these bonds. So let's start with that rule. Why is this threshold so high? And what does it mean for school districts trying to get these projects done?
I mean, this story kind of has been developing over years, but it kind of popped up more prominently in the last couple of months. A school bond measure that would have authorized 127 million in paying for deferred maintenance and other upgrades in Bismarck Public School District failed to pass in the June primary. So I was looking at, kind of data from the last decade. Just by looking at that data, it showed a lot of these votes were very close to passing. I mean, they were majority. There were many majority votes. Some were within 5% of the 60% supermajority requirement that has to be fulfilled for these school bonds to pass. I think they were trying to think back 41 failures over the last decade, and then 13 of those were within 5% of that supermajority mark, and then another 7 or so were still majority vote. On most voting it would have passed, but with the 60% requirement, those still didn't pass. So that meant those school boards would have to go back to the drawing board, look at the proposal, potentially take some of the proposals out to narrow the funding down, and then go back and approach voters and see if they would vote for it again. In the last legislative session, the rules were changed to make the voting only happen during primaries or general elections. So before, school boards could have a special vote and then people would come in and vote for it. But now they have to be on the ballot during these, primaries or general elections. So that's made things a little bit more difficult for the school boards to quickly maneuver if there's been a defeat of the school bond. They potentially could have to wait a couple years for a new primary or general election. So we had two recent failures in this June primary, the Bismarck one, and then there was one in Surrey near Minot there. And both of them were, 58%, 58.6 or something. So very, very close to that 60% supermajority threshold. Across the state, schools are getting older. Of course, there's new schools being built, but a lot of the existing schools are older. They don't have a lot of the accessible ramps. Ramps, some of them don't have ramps out front for either handicapped students or handicapped staff or people who come to visit, whether it's parents or grandparents for some kind of show, this sort of thing. Some of the schools don't have elevators, even if they have a couple different floors in the school. So that's another thing that's made it difficult for some of those schools to accept students who have certain issues, or even staff. I mean, I was speaking with this one principal in Bismarck who had a couple staff who had broken legs, and it just made things harder to move around. And one teacher would go upstairs and pretty much stay up there the rest of the day. And then, they would bring her lunch up. The principal was also speaking about in the summer, they had a student who was disabled, and their cafeteria is on the lowest level. Instead of having everybody go down to the lowest level, they brought food up to that classroom, and they all just stayed in that classroom for lunch. I mean, there's workarounds, but that's something that principals have to deal with all the time if they don't have the accessible features to their buildings. Another big issue is bathrooms, whether they're accessible or not. Some are, some aren't. Some of these older schools have very narrow entryways into bathrooms, so wheelchairs can't get through the doors. So what do you do if a teacher breaks a leg and needs to be in a wheelchair? How do you manage that if you have a new student that wants to come to that school? They either can't go to that school, they have to go somewhere else that does have those features. That potentially splits them up from siblings if the siblings don't want to go to that new school too, or if they're split up from kids they know or that they've grown up with, or people in their neighborhood that they know well. So it can be kind of destabilizing for some of these students to not be able to use that school.
These changes and things that you're talking about, these are not like beautification projects. We're not talking about making the schools prettier. We're talking about making the schools accessible for every student. And a lot of this, I'm sure, is also has to be dictated by law. We have a lot of, ADA laws and regulations that must be followed. And so they need that funding, right,
Mm,
to
yes.
get it. So, like you mentioned, and going back to how they get this funding, Bismarck got almost 59% support for its bond, still lost. Surrey got almost the same amount. I think it was 58, like you said, still lost by just a handful of votes.
Yeah,
So
5 votes.
5 votes. So that 60% requirement that it takes for any bond to pass is pretty significant, right?
Yeah, it's pretty significant. I mean, especially if the school board has, worked on a project or worked on this proposal for a long time, whether they've, reached out to architects, all this sort of thing. So these are well prepared. I think one of the big issues in speaking with superintendents and principals is, just the needs may not be communicated well enough to the general voter. And another big issue is the general voter is not going to the polls, particularly in primary elections, it can be more difficult to pass a school bond measure. So, both Bismarck and Surrey will have their new proposals on the general election here in November. Bismarck's dropped a few $1 million, and the Surrey one I think is basically going to remain the same. They don't really have time to really go through and take anything out, and their needs are quite pressing. I mean, there's some portable classrooms that had been used for a long, long time that don't meet fire code standards. There's some flooring that's kind of collapsing, I suppose you could say, and it just needs to be fixed, or that those facilities are not going to be usable. But I think communicating that has been a challenge for these school districts. I mean,
Yeah.
communicating exactly what the needs are. In some of these bonds, there's other funding that is mixed in with it, but primarily it is for maintenance, security. I mean, one of the schools I went to speak with the Bismarck Public Schools superintendent. It was a small high school that's kind of a special high school in South Bismarck. It's in need of safety measures at the front if something, somebody comes to that school with a weapon or something like that.
Mm.
So, these are another part of these proposals. I mean, it's safety, it's accessibility, it's making sure that the people that go to those schools can actually, get around the schools. A lot of these schools are older. I mean, the elementary school in Bismarck, where I spoke with the principal, it's almost 70 years old now. So some of these things I think, have been wanted for a while. It's just now that, they have a plan, because I mean, that this plan for Bismarck Public Schools upgrades of these accessibility and safety things it's part of a 23-year project of phasing in these different pieces. And one thing that happened since the failure in the primary in June is they've moved the school that I spoke with the principal, so that the upgrades will happen no matter what now.
Mm.
If the bond does pass again, it will help speed it up. It's just that those few schools that they've pushed forward, even though they don't have the funding yet, they're using their other funding, using some kind of building fund. The needs were just too pressing to ignore anymore.
Yeah. Thinking of this as a voter, now I'm not in either of those school districts, and I also don't have children in school anymore. So looking at this as a voter who doesn't have skin in the game when it comes to schools, aside from the fact that I like for kids to be educated, if I see a school bond measure on my ballot that I haven't heard a thing about, I may not vote for it because I don't know what that money is for. So I think what you said, that there's been a communication problem. Voters aren't getting the information that they need to make the decision about this. So, the school officials that you spoke to, are they recognizing this? And is there like a plan in place for the future?
Yeah, I mean, they recognize it. I mean, it's difficult because I mean, the voter turnout in the primary election, it
Mm.
was only about 20%
Yeah.
of all voters in the state. So, when that happens, it's even if they communicate to people who should be voting and they don't go vote, it's not going to really matter anyway. So, I mean, they understand it and they're trying to communicate better. And then, another issue that came up in speaking with people is just there's this kind of anti-tax feeling in general everywhere. I mean, inflation doesn't help. People's wallets are stretched right now anyway, and people don't want to approve more funding, no matter what it is. Don't want any new taxes. They might see a few different things on the ballot and then vote for the least tax, the one that has the least impact.
Yeah.
So, that's a challenge too, and it's something they're well aware of. It's just how do you communicate that and really make people understand what these funds are going to go towards?
Going back to the rule here in North Dakota that you have to have that 60% majority, the supermajority to pass a bond like this, it's not just for school districts, it's for any organization, anybody that wants to pass something like this, that 60% rule applies. But there has been some pushback recently on that. Some organizations are now saying, look, that's not going to continue to work. What are you hearing about that specifically?
Yeah, it doesn't seem like there is a concerted effort yet to roll that back. I mean, I know there's discussion going on in the background with legislators about this. I mean, there's other measures that don't have that rule. So the schools all have had that rule, and they've had it for a while. There was an idea that, since they had the ability to bring it back to voters relatively quickly before, and maybe scale back or, try to resell it, that kind of made it easier to pass a second time or maybe in a third time in some cases. But now that it has to be tied to the general and primary elections, that just makes it the timing more important about when they come up with these proposals. So I think, if if the Bismarck and the Surrey ones are back on the ballot for November. If one of those fail, or if both of those fail, you could potentially see a lot more pushback about that supermajority rule.
Yeah, and I should have said for cases like this, it applies for all of them. But there are other things that we vote on that don't require that super majority. It's a simple
Yeah,
majority.
yeah.
And what's the difference? How does the legislature determine what the difference is here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that rule just has been in place for a long time. And when they updated the requirements, they just didn't change that 60% part of the rule. They left that in place. I'm not sure exactly why they've always had that 60% majority rule. Maybe just I think a tax measure might be why it's has that higher bar. But yeah, it's created discussion about whether that's fair or not. Especially with a lot of these votes coming so close. Yeah, it's like one idea that I discussed with somebody was like, okay, well, what if it comes within that 5%?
Yeah,
And there's something that automatically triggers a special vote for that measure, and you have people come back out and vote specifically for that thing, and you might get more people turn out that really have feelings one way or the other, and then get a true picture because 20% of voters does not really give you a true picture of what, people are thinking.
right. But then, playing devil's advocate here, it can be said too, though, that if they really cared, they would have came out and voted in the first place.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, for me, I think the problem is voter turnout in general
Yeah.
for so many things, deciding things, and people don't think it's worth their time. General elections, there's a lot more. I'm not, 20% is pretty abysmal.
Yeah. Yeah. And
So we're trying to shame you into going to vote.
that's exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to get people to go vote and learn about the what we're voting on. And and again, I have to admit, if I do, I'm an informed voter. When I get the thing in the mail, I read through all the measures and whatever, and I want to know what I'm voting on. But, not everybody has worked in news for 30 years and has decided that that's what they should do. So getting that information to voters, especially about things that are so important, such as these things the schools need, it seems like that's just got to be very important. And then getting the people who are willing to vote to actually go out and do it. I do find it very interesting changing the special election rule that they can't have special elections now. It has to be during a set election. And I think that could maybe be damaging to some of these efforts by the schools.
Yeah. Yeah, it just makes it harder to do and turn something around quickly. I
Yeah.
think especially if there are really pressing needs, and then they might have to look at other sources, dipping into their general funds or whatever. I know when the Surrey thing happened, there was discussion about cutting programs and this sort of thing. So, and it's different for a really small school district with might have just one school than a big school district that has a lot of schools. So it can be pretty damaging when it happens to a smaller school like that.
One other question. If this supermajority was to get changed, is that something that would go to the voters, or is that something that the state legislature just decides?
I think in this case, it could be something that the state legislators could decide with that, specific, rule in the century code, because that's what was addressed the last time when they changed it to just have it during general or primary elections, from what I understand. And, people are discussing with legislators about that rule and whether it's a fair requirement. There could be movement in that effect in this next legislative session. I just don't know yet.
Thank you, Michael. And again, that article was headlined "School Districts Struggle to Sell Bond Measures." You can read it on our website at newscoopnd.org. For the North Dakota News Cooperative, I'm Sabrina Halvorson. This has been The Backstory.